Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Kent Archaeological Society series of talks. This is the second. Some of you may have attended the one with Richard Taylor last month about Caesar's arrival and possible places of embarkation in Britain on the Kent coast. It's a great pleasure this week to have one of our other trustees, Sheila Sweetinburgh, who's going to be talking about the Faversham Church painted pillar, and her talk is entitled Ways of Seeing Scenes from Christ's Life on Faversham's Painted Pillar. Dr. Sheila Sweetinburgh is a co-director of the Centre for Kent History and Heritage at Canterbury Christ Church University and a specialist associate lecturer in medieval and early modern studies at the University of Kent. She edited early and later medieval Kent as part of the Kent History Project series and is one of the editors for Maritime Kent Through the Ages to be published this year. She's also published widely on medieval and Tudor Kent topics using a microhistory approach, exploring themes from civic ritual to maze bowls and much in between. We're very grateful that Sheila has agreed to give this month's talk. She's been a long-term trustee of the Kent Archaeological Society, and she will be talking for about 45 minutes. If you wish to have a question, there should be a small icon with a question mark and a kind of dialogue, a sort of bubble in the on your screen. And if you could type any questions in there, then I will be able to ask them to Sheila after her talk is finished. The Kent Archaeological Society exists to promote the wider understanding of the archaeology and history of the ancient county of Kent. And we are really grateful for your support in attending this evening, and hope that you will be attending future events that we'll be holding in this series. And now I will be inviting Dr. Sweetinburgh to give her talk. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Kerry. I hope everybody can see the first slide, which is just the title. What I'm going to do is I expect lots of you know of the painted pillar. And maybe quite a lot of you have actually seen it. If you haven't, I would really suggest a trip down to Faversham when the church reopens is well worth it. And today I'm going to be, well, this evening, I'm going to be using slides of images taken by my very good friend Imogen Corrigan, which I hope will give you a good idea of just how wonderful this pillar is. And what I want to do this evening is to think about it with you as it may have been envisaged and used in the later Middle Ages by people in their devotional lives. So I'm going to take you back in time, I hope. And to do this, I'm going to take you on a tour of the pillar. But first I want to explore what may have been the catalyst for such a high quality church painting to have been made in the first place. However, I freely acknowledge that nobody wrote down their feelings or responses to the pillar. Consequently, this investigation rests heavily on its potential use by contemporaries rather than on solid documentary or other evidence. Or to put it another way, this is an experiment of thinking about process and how it relates to construction and reception, which I think is not only applicable in terms of Faversham, but also elsewhere. So, the painted pillar's context, or how and why may it have come about. Now, I'm sure you're all well aware that Faversham was a royal town, and that King Stephen decided to give the manor of Faversham to his newly founded abbey on the edge of the town in 1147. This at times brought friction between the people of Faversham and their overlord, and it's a situation you can find or could certainly have found in lots of the Cinque Ports during the Middle Ages. And of course, Faversham was a Cinque Port because it was linked to its head port of Dover. However, Faversham Abbey was not the only ecclesiastical heavyweight in the town, because the advowson, or patronage of the only parish church in Faversham, that is St Mary's, was held by St Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury. Now, issues surrounding hierarchy, status and jurisdiction were not solely contentious between civic and church authorities in the Middle Ages and, to be honest, beyond, but they were just as likely between different institutions within the church. And this is where Faversham rather got drawn in. So I want to take you back to late 13th century Faversham. By this time, the leading citizens had managed to wrest some rights and privileges from Faversham Abbey, and they'd even managed to acquire a common seal by the 1290s. Nevertheless, the abbot of Faversham Abbey was not keen to let go, and the senior men of Faversham were heavily engaged in mounting a defence in the King's Court in that very late 13th century period. And that involved hiring the services of a lawyer and getting themselves a copy of Magna Carta. And the idea is, I think, in the relatively near future, that Magna Carta will be indeed on show in the Heritage Hub, actually in the centre of Faversham. However, this was not the only tussle taking place in Faversham. St Augustine's Abbey had long maintained that it answered only to the Pope and certainly not to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And while some archbishops were prepared not to press the issue, others were very keen to press it. And amongst these was Archbishop Winchelsea. And as occurred a century earlier, Archbishop Hubert Walter had similarly indeed pressed the case that St Augustine's was under the Archbishop. Now, in late 13th century Faversham, things turned nasty when Archbishop Winchelsea clashed with St Augustine's Abbey. They clashed because the Abbot Findon had been appointed a year earlier, and he was in a sense using his muscle in terms of St Augustine's Abbey, and therefore was on a collision course with the new Archbishop. Now, caught between the Archbishop and the Abbey, the vicar at Faversham, Peter de Milstead, found himself excommunicated and turned out of his vicarage by the abbot in the autumn of 1300. After he took his oath to the Archbishop rather than the abbot as his superior. He'd previously taken his oath to the abbot, but then rescinded that and went with the Archbishop. Now, the abbot sent monks to Faversham to celebrate Mass and other services, but Peter didn't give in and instead celebrated Masses at other local churches, taking a sizable proportion of the townspeople with him. Things came to a head when a Faversham man died and his coffin was fought over in the street. On one side were his family and friends with the mayor and other armed men, and on the other side they were confronted by armed monks, clerks and their supporters. Now, the mayor's party wanted to bury the man at neighbouring Preston, where the service would be conducted by Peter. The monks wanted the corpse buried in the churchyard of Faversham Parish Church. Exactly what happened next is not really clear, But St Augustine's story was that when they took the rioters to court, was that the mayor's party had sounded the common horn, which brought more townspeople, and in the subsequent melee, the monks dropped the coffin in the churchyard and fled into the church. The monks were again attacked by this mob led by the mayor and the vicar. The doors of the church were broken down, the bell ropes were cut, and church ornaments and vestments belonging to the abbey were seized. Now, this conflict continued for the next couple of years until the Archbishop, and thus the vicar and his supporters, finally got the upper hand in 1304. As a result, about 1307, new regulations were drawn up between St Augustine's and Peter's successor, whereby St Augustine's agreed to repair and rebuild the chancel, and it seems highly likely from the architecture of Faversham Church that the leading townsmen took the opportunity to rebuild and redecorate their part of the church, that is the nave and the transepts. And this sort of development, although not due to such a violent incident, was taking place in many parish churches in the late 13th and early 14th century. So I now want to move on to why paint a pillar? Well, medieval churches were covered in wall paintings. Sometimes there was an overarching scheme which might relate to a series of saints or to scenes relating to the life and passion of Christ and or the life of his mother. Now, often, but not exclusively, these were nave wall paintings. And if you're thinking about nave wall paintings, you need to think about how you would read a book. So if you think about it, or if you think about the north wall of the church, you started in the west and you moved towards the east. And if you're thinking about the south wall of the church, you move from the east towards the west. And you started at the top and worked your way down. So that's walls. But walls were not the only places where you found wall paintings, because you could also find them on pillars. Pillars offered these further spaces, and they were seen as valuable in their own right. And one of the reasons they were seen as valuable was due to the symbolism that was attached to everything within the parish church. And according to William Durand, a 13th century bishop and theologian, just as columns held up the church buildings, so bishops and theologians were seen as sustaining the church. And this idea of symbolism is to be found, as I say, within the parish church, just about everywhere. Symbolism was only limited by man's inability to understand all the symbolism that God could put forward. So you can, in a sense, almost can't push symbolism too far from that perspective in the medieval period. Now, an 8-sided pillar is, of course, very valuable in and of itself, but it's also important in terms of the idea of the 8 sides, because 8 was seen symbolically as introducing the idea of regeneration. Creation had been achieved in 7 days, and therefore the 8th day was the idea of regeneration. And if you're thinking about fonts, you've got again that idea of 8. Now, as far as Faversham is concerned, we have got our 8-sided pillar. in the case of St Albans Abbey, there are 6 of these round pillars, and it is worth noting that here these pillars were used as a reredos, the 2 paintings here, for an altar, and we'll come back to that idea of altars in a little while. So if we're thinking about Faversham's pillar, it's in the north transept. So it's lying in lay space rather than being in the chancel, which was clerical space. And this differentiation between lay and clerical space was becoming more important from that late 13th century onwards. So just at the time that this is taking place. Now you can see where I've pointed to which of the pillars we're going to be looking at, and it's also worth noting that there are traces of paint on 3 other of the transept pillars. In other words, the 4 nearest the central nave and chancel of the church. This, unfortunately, is the only survivor. So the next thing is to think about what's on the pillar. Well, we have our 8 faces, and on the top tier we have 2 major scenes of Christ's Passion and a 3rd scene. If this will work, yes, we have 1 scene of the Passion there, 1 scene of the Passion there, and then here we have, it's now very difficult to tell what it is, but it's either a tree or a vine. Then if we're looking below that, we've got the middle and bottom tiers provide us with 6 scenes from Christ's Nativity. Again, they vary in length, and we'll be going through those in a bit of detail in a minute. But I think there are 2 crucial issues that we need to take into account when we're actually looking at the pillar. The first thing that I think is crucial is the line of sight of either Christ or the Virgin Mary, and I'll explain that as we go through. And the second thing I think is absolutely crucial is the west facing side of the pillar. So here, as you can see, on the top tier we have Christ's crucifixion. On the second, on the middle, we have the Christ child suckling as part of the Nativity. And then on the bottom tier, we have the Virgin and Child as the final panel of the Adoration of the Magi. So if we're thinking about lines of sight, which is where I want to start, so you can see if we're looking at we're here, as you can see, on the bottom tier. And if we start with the Annunciation to the Virgin, we have Gabriel who faces Mary. And I think predominantly you're to see this as a self-contained unit. Particularly in the case of Mary, Mary is definitely looking towards Gabriel. I think Gabriel is primarily looking towards Mary, but if Gabriel is looking anywhere else at all, then he's looking up. And if he's looking up, then he's looking up to another angel associated with the Annunciation to the shepherds. But I think primarily you're to see this as self-contained. If we move to the second, so we're moving conventionally right to the right around the pillar, as you would read a book, we meet Mary and her cousin Elizabeth. So here we have cousin Elizabeth, and here we have Mary. Now Mary is slightly shorter than her cousin, which means that she looks up and left. And by so doing, she looks up to the shepherds. So she joins the shepherds who like their dog here. I absolutely adore this dog. I think that's absolutely fantastic to actually get the dog in there. You have both the dog and the shepherds looking up and partly towards the angel, and by so doing, in that way, they stay on this level, but they also look up and are confronted by St. John at the crucifixion. So if we're thinking about that idea of moving conventionally towards the right, here we've got the shepherds looking up and to the left. So I think from that point of view, you need to think about the shepherds and where they're looking. The angel, in contrast, if anything, is conventionally looking beyond the shepherds to the presentation of Christ in the temple, which we'll come to in a minute. So I think, again, this is the only time, in a sense, where you've got, it's not Christ or the Virgin Mary, but it is the shepherds who are looking. If we then move on to our next set of paintings, we come to the Nativity. Now, as you can see, I hope, Joseph has disappeared. He's been lost. But he would have been looking towards Mary and the child. And the scene is, in a sense, completed above by the ox and the ass. Again, they're looking towards the centre. However, Mary looks neither at Christ nor at Joseph, but down and to the right. And that, I think, is in a sense, is really important. Whereas in a sense, Christ is to a degree looking towards his earthly father. So if we're taking it this time, Mary's line of sight, this takes us down, her and the viewer, down to the adoration of the Magi. Now, this is a 4-panel scene. It's the longest in the Nativity tiers. And it finishes with Mary, as you can see here. And we have Mary and we have Christ. And as we've already seen, she's on the west facing of the bottom tier. Now, this is not the Virgin Mary as in the earthly mother of Christ at the Nativity. As you can see, she's crowned. So we're seeing her as Queen of Heaven. And she's staring out towards the viewer. But Christ on her lap, and the Christ child is haloed, which I don't know if I can see just there. Christ is looking left and up. And again, so he's looking against the conventions and he's looking up. So he's looking up against the conventions in both cases. And if we then move on to the next one, we come to the presentation in the temple. And what we have here is the final nativity sequence. Christ's presentation in the temple, that idea of Candlemas, that idea of the purification of Our Lady. And of course, this also ended the Christmas tide season. So it's an important final scene from that perspective. Now here again, we've got Joseph and Mary, and they are looking at their child. Simeon looks at Christ and upwards, and Christ even more looks beyond Simeon and meets the gaze of his crucified self on the top tier. And I don't know if you can see, but Christ's hand is raised in blessing. And it's also worth noting that we have on this Christian altar in the temple what appears to be a chalice. So really important from that perspective. We move up to the top tier and therefore the Passion sequence. We have the crucifixion. And we have, as we've already seen, Christ staring down at his infant self. But neither Mary nor St. John engage with any of the figures. Instead, they're looking down sorrowfully, and St. John's gesture is one of incomprehension. So at this point we've got a really important sequence, and again, if we remember, this is on the west-facing part of the pillar. If we move to the final Passion sequence, we've got the empty tomb, and we've got the three Marys, as you would expect. Now, in a sense, we have two pairs here. So we have the first Mary who faces the angel, while her two companions face each other. And they're all standing behind the empty tomb, from which the cloth, which wrapped Christ's body, sticks out. So again, we've got how the painter is using the pillar. So again, the importance of the sequence is brought up by the fact that we've actually got 4 panels for it. And then you can just about see on this side that the final one panel of the tree or the vine is very difficult to read. Now, it could be seen possibly as Christ as the vine, or the tree of life, or the tree of paradise. Could also be possibly seen as the idea of the acanthus tree, which was symbolic of death and the afterlife, and therefore the resurrection. Or even possibly the perediction tree, with its doves, which came from the physiologus and symbolically provided the protection of the Trinity. Or if we might even possibly, the fact that it is very sort of serpent-like, are we looking back to that idea of Eden and Eve, and the fact that Mary, through her redemptive powers, is almost putting right the first sin of Eve. Now, why is this exciting? Well, I just want to give you just briefly some ideas about seeing from a medieval perspective. There were 2 theories in relation to seeing. There was the idea of extra mission, the idea of the eye actively seeing by sending out rays that lighted on an object to make it visible. That was one theory. But there was also the theory of intromission, where the image sent out rays that passed into the idea and then to different parts of the brain. So you had a dynamic relationship between subject and object. Added to this, there was the idea that, yes, you saw with the bodily eye, but that could be transformed into seeing by the mind's eye. And as a result, that would reveal higher spiritual levels of knowledge. And this enhanced seeing brought into play the viewer's emotional engagement with the image. For example, Christ's suffering on the cross would bring a heightened sense of devotion, what is commonly called affective piety, an emotional response. And if anybody has ever read the book of Marjorie Kemp, you will see the affective piety in action. Now, not everybody agreed that this was right. There was a feeling at times that this was excessive or indiscreet love or idolatry, and this was particularly the feeling of the Lollards at the time. But affective piety was very important in terms of medieval devotion. So thinking about the whole of the pillar, we've got Christ's mother is present in all bar 2 scenes. So like her son, she plays a principal role, and it's her line of sight that the viewer follows as much as Christ. And this is probably not surprising, considering that the church at Faversham is dedicated to Our Lady. But I now want to, in a sense, take us to the sort of final part of this talk, where I want to sort of look at the wills from the church for the later Middle Ages. So we've looked at the construction, we've looked at process in terms of construction. Now I want to look at process in terms of reception. And to do this, as I say, I'm going to draw on the wills for Faversham. Now, in the 15th century, as well as the high altar, there were about 14 subsidiary altars in Faversham Parish Church, including the chapel of St Thomas of Canterbury in the north chancel aisle, which I hope you can see there. And on the south side, we've got the Trinity Chapel. Also on the north side, we've got the aisle of St John, and that would have seemed to have indicated an altar in the east wall of the north transept, because there is a piscina that survives, or at least part of a piscina, and John Priest left 5 marks for a priest to sing for his soul at the altar of St John the Baptist. And I think this is significant because St John the Baptist could be linked to the Holy Family and to the idea of the Eucharist, because St John the Baptist could also be seen through his own sacrificial role in biblical history as providing that link to the Eucharist. Now, many of the other altars and the 3 further chapels are likely to have been in the nave and the south transept, and there were 2 chapels in the cemetery. Now, among the various altars, we get the usual Virgin Martyrs and traditional saints. So we've got St Clement, St Nicholas and St Peter, but there's also the Morrow Mass altar. And the high altar was called the Jesus altar, and I think that's really, really interesting. The Jesus Mass came into Kent pretty early. We have a reference to it in Sandwich in the 1460s, and that's early. Kent is very much in the vanguard of these new devotions, and I think Faversham, because of its trading links, is sort of part of this from that perspective. The church had more lights than any other parish church in Kent. There were at least 27, including some more unusual ones, like the light of St. Siph and Master John Sean and Our Lady of Gessin or Bedlam. And we'll come back to Our Lady of Gessin in a minute, because that's especially interesting, and it was said to be in the north part of the church. Now, I think the location and the pillar's emphasis on the nativity suggests that they could be one and the same. In other words, the column's nativity painting on the west side, facing side of the pillar, where Mary is shown suckling Christ as she half reclines, could be the image of Our Lady of Gessin. And it means Our Lady in childbed. And therefore you would have had lights, candles set before it. Now, I agree this is to a degree speculative, but it is certainly possible we actually are looking at an altar there, not least because there was said to be an image of Christ in this area. And as we've already noted, that on the west-facing images of the pillar all have this Eucharistic imagery. So we've got at the bottom the Magi worshipping at the altar of Christ. In the centre, we've got the lactating Virgin nurturing Christ, who in turn nurtured mankind through his blood at the crucifixion. And we have, of course, the crucifixion, which is directly above. And we go back to the nave pillars in St Albans Abbey, you've got those same sort of images in terms of the reredos there. And furthermore, we have the squint from the anchor hold, which was just outside the parish church. And the line of sight from that anchor hold would have included the painted pillars west face. So I can't prove it, but I think, all of these things help us to understand what was going on there. Now, if we're thinking about the other lights that were dedicated to the Virgin Mary in the church, we find that from the wills, some of the images were very well supported. In particular, Our Lady of Pity in the south aisle. And if you remember, we've got here the altars of Our Lady of Pity and St Anne. And of course, St Anne was the mother of Mary. So very much we've got that in the two transepts. The Holy Family are in a sense extraordinarily well represented. And if we're thinking about late medieval piety, that move from Christ's divinity to Christ's humanity was a very, very important factor. So the idea of the Holy Family, in a sense, was a central part of that, part of the ideas of devotion. So we've got the fact that we have these altars, and we have therefore a series of popular foci for the cult of the Virgin Mary around the church. So they're offering parishioners as worshippers considerable opportunities to either concentrate on one image or to move from one image to another around the building. And they would do that. And what they might do in terms of thinking about Christ, so in a sense, the idea was that they would, within their mind's eye, see themselves with Mary at the crucifixion. So they are imagining and engaging emotionally with Christ and his mother at the crucifixion and at the Nativity. And of course, at that idea of the altar in relation to the presentation in the temple. And they would do this through prayers, and particularly in terms of books of hours, in relation to the hours of the Virgin and the hours of the cross. And if I'm right, then at the painted pillar, this could have been a particularly important and special liturgical space, which was both linked to the Christmastide celebrations and also in a sense, the Eucharist and the Mass that would take place there. Furthermore, of course, it's very close to St. Thomas's Chapel, and therefore if pilgrims were drawn there as they were on their way to Canterbury, they would pass the pillar and possibly again engage in the saying of prayers as a result. Now, since I'm coming to the conclusion, but I'm not quite there yet. So if we're thinking about surviving records, can they actually tell us any more, or is it in sense pure speculation in terms of the potential of the pillar as a place of devotion? Well, I think there are tantalizing pointers that come from Faversham, in so much as I think that in a sense we can put forward the idea that the people in late medieval Faversham did have knowledge and understanding of relatively sophisticated ideas about spirituality. And I'm basing that on the fact that there's a presence of poetry associated with the mystic John of Bridlington in the town's costume hall. And this provides ideas about meditation and about mystical experience. Now, this is hardly surprising considering Faversham's trading contacts in this country and overseas. Thus, I think the painted pillar can provide us with some really interesting ideas about the spiritual life of the church for the townsfolk. But just as a final slide, I want to point out that yes, I am perfectly well aware that the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. But I just want to point you to this tomb in Sandwich in St. Peter's Church. And if you look at the recumbent husband and wife effigies, and you follow the line of sight of the images of the effigies, you would find that they actually are at the point in front of the altar where at the point of transubstantiation the chalice would have been held. So I think in a sense lines of sight are really important for medieval people, and for us to try and understand medieval people, we've got to try and think back into their lives. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Sorry about that slight technical problem. I just had a couple of quick questions before I go to on the Q&A. I mean, is it possible to give a bit of context of this particular kind of art? I mean, you know, are there comparable works in I mean, you mentioned in Sandwich, but that's obviously slightly different, but are there comparable works like this in Kent, in England, or even in Europe? I mean, presumably there was a European dimension to this. You mentioned the importance of the Catholic Church I mean, is there something that sort of is similar to this that you can compare it with?
Yeah, I mean, we've got, it's usually wall paintings rather than on painted columns. That's the point. So you've got the passion sequences are the more usual. You've got lots of parish churches with those. There's a particularly good group in the sort of Gloucester round towards sort of Oxford area. There are some fantastic ones, again from the similar sort of period, sort of late 13th and into the 14th centuries. But it's, I say, it's more on the walls. It's the fact that this is on a column is interesting. Obviously you have got column paintings because you've got them at St Albans Abbey. Now, whether, of course, Faversham, they painted on the column because the walls were already covered. Who knows? I mean, they've got everything else as well. There's some paintings in the Chapel of St Thomas, but that's all that's left now. But these are very high quality. I mean, they are definitely, as far as art historians are concerned, this is really high quality early 14th century paintings in terms of the draperies and in terms of the sort of the sinewy shapes of the figures. So it's top-notch stuff. Now, whether, of course, we're looking at a painter from Canterbury, it's a possibility. Equally, of course, we could be looking at a painter from London or even from overseas. But I mean, Faversham was an important trading port, so it did attract high-end people, both sort of living there and also passing through. And so you've got wealth, you've got prosperous people who would be able to afford to be the patrons of such paintings from that perspective. So yes, they are, in terms of subject matter, you've got other paintings in Kent and elsewhere in England that are even more in terms of the passion. But it's the pillar that's the really interesting part.
Great, thank you. So we have one question here, which is really about the tension or even conflict between St Augustine's Abbey and the Archbishop. So it sort of relates tangentially to kind of Faversham. But could you say a bit more about that and whether there's any literature available on it? This is just a comment from the Q&A box.
If you mean literature in terms of has people written about it, yes, to a certain extent. But if you want actually to follow the conflict, then if you can get hold of a Davis's copy of William Thorne's Chronicle from St Augustine's Abbey, Thorne goes into great detail in terms of the dispute between this particular archbishop and the abbey. He also goes into great detail in terms of every dispute between St Augustine's and the abbey, and St Augustine's and Christ Church, and St Augustine's and anybody else from that point of view. So yes, there is, and I mean, Davis is a translation of Thorne's Chronicle, so in a sense you can actually read it in English from that perspective, in modern English. But the fact that St Augustine's saw itself as only under Rome, I mean, these sort of tensions are reasonably common between different ecclesiastical bodies from that perspective.
Great, thank you. So we've got another question here which is really about the lines of sight. So it's from Michael. Would all lines of sight in 14th century effigies be seen to look at important focal points? I mean, they're all equally important?
No, I think there's a hierarchy, and you can, at times, the artist would actually denote the lines of sight by actually painting lines between his sort of figures. Or so from that point of view, if you want to make it absolutely explicit, that's what you did. So from that point of view, no, I say that there's definitely a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is primarily based on, in a sense, your biblical hierarchy. So in a sense, you're putting Christ and his mother at the top, and then you sort of work your way down. So, but you can do the same thing with saints. If you think that the idea was that if the painting of St. Christopher was usually on the opposite wall to the entrance into the church. So the idea being that when you entered the church, you were seen by St. Christopher, and St. Christopher saw you. And that relationship meant that you were, therefore, St. Christopher would protect you that day. So from that point of view, the way the saint is looking at you mattered. So it's the relationships within the paintings, but it's also the relationship between the paintings and the viewer.
Great, thank you. And so if anyone has any questions, then please do put them in the Q&A box. You said that Faversham had very special rights towards the end of your talk. You talked about the special rights it had. Why did it have those special rights?
You've lost me a minute. Are the special rights in terms of?
You said that there were, I think 20. You referred to this sort of.
Number of lights. Sorry.
Oh yes,
lights,
sorry. Okay.
Lights.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. 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 Well, it had all these devotional points in the church, and when we say light, we mean candles. So you would put candles in front of an image, or an altar, or a painting. In other words, devotional points within the church. So the fact you've got nearly 30 of these devotional points within the church is extremely unusual. And the fact you've got some quite interesting ones from that point of view, that you've got the usual sort of traditional saints that you would expect: Clement, Nicholas, Peter, usual Virgin Martyrs, Catherine, what have you. But you've also got St. Sith and Master John Sean. And Master John Sean was one of those late medieval saints in inverted commas, in so much as he was a pious individual from North Marston in Buckinghamshire, who was said to have found effectively a miraculous well, and people who took the waters were cured of gout and toothache, and he was believed to have cast the devil into a boot, and he's shown most frequently with the boot, with the devil trying to, in a sense, get out of the boot. Now, of course, he was never canonized, but his devotion was sufficient that his bones were taken to Windsor, if I remember rightly, and he becomes, in a sense, patronized by the royal family. So you know, these sort of late medieval saints were either politically motivated, or they were this sort of rather oddball that you sort of get in the case of Master John Sean.
Great. So I've got a couple of questions here. One is, when was the pillar painting in Faversham actually discovered? I mean, if it was sort of rediscovered. And then a sort of more technical question, how would a squint be used instead of direct observation from within the church? I mean, you referred to a squint. I presume this just sort of sounds like, why would you need that if you could just look at the thing directly? So yeah, right. Those two.
Okay, in terms of, I think it was found at some point in the 20th century. I mean, it's relatively very recently found, in so much as Elizabeth Edwards, who grew up in Faversham, was telling me she didn't know anything about it until very recently. So we are looking in the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years, maybe, something like that. It's been found. Now, in terms of the squint, you were looking from outside the church. That's the point. So your anchor hold, where your anchorite or anchoress lived, was just outside the church. So it's a sort of bit like a little cabin built onto the church, with a line of sight into the church, so that the anchorite or anchoress could observe the mass when it was being celebrated. So you need to be able to see from outside. So although, yeah, I mean, obviously I couldn't show you the squint from outside because it's now been bricked up. You can't see from outside into the church. But that's where you would have been. You would have been outside and looking in.
Okay. And then there's a couple of questions here about, yeah, I mean, the sort of relationship between this wall painting and graffiti. I mean, you know, the kind of extraordinary graffiti in Rochester Cathedral and other churches. And these are now being recognised. I mean, does graffiti kind of figure in Faversham Church, St Mary's in Faversham, or was graffiti placed over the paintings?
No, it was, I mean, they were whitewashed. I mean, that's what happened to most paintings. They were either scraped off, or if you're lucky, they were just whitewashed over, in which case that's actually protected them. And when you remove the whitewash, as long as you're careful, they're still there. In terms of graffiti, I don't know of any graffiti in Faversham, but to be honest, I haven't looked for it. It's certainly, in some cases, it's likely that the graffiti was actually done by, maybe not the painter, but by, in a sense, masons or those who were working on the church, rather than others who came into the church, shall we say, as visitors or whatever. So in a sense, some graffiti is very high quality because in a sense it was done by masons and similar artisans from that perspective. But it does vary tremendously from that point of view. I mean, there's some of the graffiti in Canterbury Cathedral crypt, which, yeah, they think was done when the crypt was being sort of renovated under Anselm, and also in that period when the Trinity Chapel above was also being done. So in a sense, you know, you are looking at high quality, and it's being done with a chisel. It's not done with a knife, and it, you know, somebody has taken time to do it. So it's not a pilgrim who is just coming in with his knife, you know, scraping on the pillar or whatever, or the wall or whatever it is, where the graffiti is. So there's, again, you've got a whole range of graffiti from that perspective.
Great, thank you. So here's a couple of questions on the desecration from the Reformation. So, you know, why did the pillars survive intact over that period? And then one question on the new style of mass, which came in the 1460s. Someone is asking, you know, did you? I mean, I think you mentioned that. So what did that involve? I mean, what kind of impact did that have?
Okay. In terms of the Reformation, what usually happened, an awful lot of whitewash. Obviously, you take out the statue. Well, the statues are usually desecrated, usually burnt, hacked to pieces, whatever, depending on how strong the feelings were of those who were, in a sense, attacking them. But in terms of the actual walls, it's usually whitewash. If you look in church wardens' accounts, you'll find lots of money spent on whitewash. So that's what happened in terms of that. In terms of the Jesus Mass, which comes into Kent in the 1460s, this is the Mass of the name of Jesus, and it's a devotion that is focusing very much on Christ in terms of the Passion. So it is very much focusing on thinking about the 5 wounds of Christ. So it's the Mass of the 5 wounds. So the Jesus Mass, there's a whole series of these masses associated with Christ and Christ's humanity. That's the point. So you're getting images at this particular point, and paintings as well, where Christ's body is really shown as broken, very, very skinny. The painters and the sculptors are accentuating Christ's suffering as a way of gaining the emotional response of viewers, and therefore getting much greater devotion through their emotional engagement with Christ and Christ's suffering from mankind, leading on to the resurrection. So you've got the crucifixion and then the resurrection, and in a sense the resurrection here is shown by the empty tomb. So in a sense you're using that idea of presence and absence in relation to the two scenes. Christ is present at the crucifixion, he's absent at the resurrection. But it's Christ's suffering, that's what you're looking for. So you will, I say, find paintings of Christ where there's vast amounts of blood shown on Christ. It is really, really gory as a way of engaging with people's emotions from that perspective. And to say that the Mass of the 5 wounds and the Mass of Jesus is very much linked into that.
Great, thank you. So 2 more. You mentioned chroma on some of the other pillars. Do you have any kind of information on the subject matter of those? And would parishioners and pilgrims be looking at these pillars before the services? Or did they actually sort of perform a function whenever you kind of went into the church, regardless of the services? How did they kind of, operate, I guess, in terms of ritual?
You can't tell. There's the amount of paint that's left on the other 3 pillars is so minute, you can't tell. I would have thought it's highly likely you've got you would have had paintings from the life of the Virgin, maybe more from the Passion sequence, and maybe more of the Nativity. I think, in a sense, they would have revolved around those 3 areas. So the life of the Virgin, Christ's life in relation to his nativity in particular, and the Passion. In terms of how people use them and when they use them, your Faversham had more than it had its parish priest, but it had brotherhood priests as well. So they would have been celebrating using the canonical hours just as you would do in a monastery. So you would have they would have been celebrating the divine service. So there would have been 7 services a day going on in that church as a minimum. Now your parishioners would be in lay space within the church, which basically means your nave and your transepts, and obviously the aisles that go with the transepts. The parishioners would not have been in the chancel, and probably not so much in either the Trinity Chapel or St Thomas's Chapel. They could to a degree, but in a sense not as much. So your parishioners could indeed have been at services at the same when they were being conducted, but this is not to say that your parishioners could not have come into the church at other times as well. So they could have engaged with the painted pillar, if I'm right, with the altar of Our Lady of Gessen, not only during service times, but also at other times as well. So they could have followed the prayers within if they had a book of hours themselves, or in a sense they could have prayed the Paternoster, which it was expected that everybody knew. So from that point of view, the choices were up to the parishioners. But the fact you've got a morrow mass altar rather indicates that you had a very early mass of the day, because that was the whole point of that, was the fact that that was the first mass of the day. And if you were a working person, you could come in, obviously you weren't going to partake of the mass, but you could indeed engage as witness to the mass, and then you would go and work in your normal day.
Great, thank you. And so 3 final questions. Mary and St John appear as statues on the rood loft above the rood screen. Is there any link here between the location of the pillars in the church near where a rood screen may have been? So that's the first question. The second question is quite simply, are the pillars, is the pillar protected by varnish? And then a final question, which is about this concept of 8 linking to revivification, hence 8-sided fonts and the careful positioning of the column. Does this speak to the does this speak to the drama of personal devotion and moving around the church as ductus, D-U-C-T-U-S? So there's a final 3 questions.
Right. First one was, sorry.
The rood screen and the location screen.
Rood screen. Yes. It's not far from the rood screen. In so much as if you think about it, your rood screen would have been across here. So in a sense, you're not far from that perspective. And of course, not only are you, Mary would have been on Christ's right hand side. So in a sense, she would have been on the same side as the pillar from that perspective. And quite often you would have the Lady Chapel on the north side as well. You would also, women were usually on the north, in terms of when parishioners were in the church, then women were expected to be on the north side, men were on the south side. So that it's close. So in a sense, you've got all these positions around the church from that perspective. So yes, they're towards the east end of the lay part of the church. Sorry, Kerry, what was the second one?
The second is just varnish. Yes, is it?
No,
just about
I don't
varnish?
think there's. I'm not sure, but I don't think there is varnish. But I'm not an art historian, so I wouldn't like to sort of pass judgment on that one.
And then it's just a devotional drama, personal devotion. Yeah.
Yes, I think people did. I mean, of course, I can't. I mean, without a time machine, I will never know. But if you look at what we know from elsewhere, as far as we can tell, and the fact that there are manuals as to how people should act in relation to their devotion, then the answer is yes. I think very much Faversham Parish Church had that potential. Whether that potential was realised by any or all, we will never know. But the fact that it was even, the potential was there, I think is significant, and it gives us ways of thinking about how medieval people responded. That in a sense, paintings are not for the illiterate. This idea that, you know, just because we are literate, or at least we think we're literate, you know, we are so much more sophisticated than medieval people is wrong. Apart from anything else, literacy meant being able to read and write in Latin. It didn't mean English at all. But these paintings are sophisticated. They require an understanding of the symbolism that was present throughout medieval society, and it was a symbolism that they got just like that. Just as we see an advert and immediately know what's behind it, they could understand symbolism in the same way. So symbolism had at least 4 meanings. I mean, in terms of any image or any painting had at least 4 meanings behind it. And in a sense, the idea was that you were looking for at least those 4, and if not more. So all the time you're looking for greater depth and complexity within in your image, and that, of course, is leading towards your devotion. That's the whole point of this. Is this all leading towards salvation?
Great, thank you very much indeed. And so I'd like to express my thanks to Sheila, our trustee, for giving up her time this evening. This is one of the many talks and lectures that we are hosting at the Kent Archaeological Society, and they will be available on the Kent Archaeological Society YouTube channel for anyone to rewatch. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, to click on subscribe below and to give us a thumbs up or even make a comment, and we'll include links and further information in the description. Our next meeting will be on the 26th of March at 7 o'clock, where Giles Dawkes will be talking about the excavations at Snodland Roman Villa. And then again, next month on the 13th of April, our other trustee, Rob Laguerre, will be talking about underground Kent. We really, really appreciate you joining us this evening, and thank you for your time. And again, thank you to Sheila for a wonderful talk on these amazing pillars in Faversham Church. Thank you very much, and good night, everyone.